Hello everyone, welcome to the last week of class. I hope you are all doing good in your final projects. So this week we read a lot about activism and social justice. And just to give you a little bit of background on why I chose this particular piece from our readings to work on the discussion is because I am currently working on a research project with one of the universities in Kansas, working on equal access opportunities in healthcare for Indigenous populations in Guatemala. Living in the United States, living in Kansas to be more specific. And so this week's reading of Paths Towards Autonomy in Indigenous Women's Movements, Berman reveals that there is a big difference, even clash in views of Indigenous women's activists who claim that colonialism is the source of their ills, and that mestiza feminist activists often use and see Indigenous women as the token or the official conversation piece for decolonization. And so this is important to note because, so just for those of you who might not know, the mestizo or mestizos are those considered mixed bloods in Latin American countries. I myself, I am a mestiza because I have Indigenous and European blood in my line. But a lot of these Latin American countries continue to have a large part of their population are mestizas, which means that they have been mixed by European and Indigenous ancestors. But there's still a large thousands and thousands of Indigenous populations that have not been mixed. And so this creates the promotion of national identities within these countries based on the mestizo race, which creates hierarchies of ethnic differences within these communities. And so, according to Berman, a lot of the literature on Indigenous movements that seek to explore and understand the political mobilization have generally lacked or completely ignored gender as a variable. And so Berman emphasizes that there's a dual transformation in Latin America for social identities towards neoliberalism, citizenship, and democratic politics, that a lot of the Indigenous activists see as a threat for their survival of their communities, their Indigenous communities. So I used a feminist ethnography approach to understand the structural determinants of Indigenous women's health for this project, for the research project. And I drew on the research about the colonial and post-colonial origins of ethnic and gender equalities in Guatemala, more specifically the Indigenous regions. So in order to identify the different ways in which women have historically been disadvantaged and the processes and the situations and interaction dynamics that have emerged from this, we found, or the findings suggest, that the gender inequalities were introduced in the colonial system, right? So the colonial era brought in the governing practices for Indigenous regions. And so because of this, the associated structures, the social constructs of marriage, and the dynamics of colonial community, and even interpersonal relationships now operate as the forms of institutionalized gender oppression that continue to increase the vulnerability of Indigenous women. And it influences the decisions that they take or their community takes on healthcare access and even childbirth. So this ethnographic data was analyzed in the historical context the colonial or colonialism brings, but also it was contrasted to the data that we are collecting nowadays, the current research. And we find that there's evidence that colonial forms of inequality continue to impact the well-being and health of Indigenous women's rights. There's a lot of welfare and health programs and activism that increasingly aims to address the gender inequality by balancing or rebalancing, I should say, the gender social construct, the household dynamics, and trying to empower women. But again, the historical and colonial roots of these inequalities remain unchanged, which means that we have to do a lot more work than just talk about it or do halfway research. Because we know that Indigenous women's health continues to be one of the lower overall healths in the population, in Kansas especially. So most of those who participate in the research that we do are males, and that is not surprise. Berman talked about the lack of the gender lens when we're talking about the research of Indigenous women's Indigenous populations and social justice. And so even at a local level, I can see that a lot of the participants we have are males, and that is often because males are typically the ones that can that go out of the house, that learn a different language, whether that is English or for most of them Spanish, because a lot of the Indigenous populations still speak primarily their dialects, and the research that we're doing, the majority of our participants speak Quiche or Nan or some of the other dozens of dialects that the Guatemalan community speaks. And so, yeah, what do you all think? Do we feel that we forget or purposely miss the gender lens when we do research, not specifically to Indigenous populations, but in overall? I think that's something that we have discussed throughout the class, but I just thought it was a really interesting connection to the work that I am doing and the readings of this class. Anyways, I hope to hear more from all of you, and can't wait to answer your questions.